What would you do if you came home early? Your wife texted, "I'm in our bed." You sent a selfie of the empty sheets, and 20 minutes later she burst in panicking, still insisting you were the one misunderstanding everything? My name is Miles Hart, and I learned something ugly about silence the night I came home early and found our place breathing like an empty stage, clean enough to look innocent and quiet enough to feel guilty. The trip was supposed to stretch into the weekend, which meant Elena had the calendar to herself, the bed to herself, and whatever story she needed to tell herself about being a good wife while I was away. But my last meeting ended fast. The highway was clear, and I rolled into the condo garage with that tired, satisfied feeling you get when the world gives you one small favor and you do not yet know the invoice is coming. I parked in my spot, listened to the engine tick as it cooled, and noticed the building was too calm for early evening, which should have been normal, except normal has a smell, a rhythm, a background noise, and tonight the air felt like it had been wiped down with disinfectant and haste. I carried my bag to the elevator, watched the mirrored walls catch my face in sharp angles, and wondered why I felt like I was arriving at a stranger's apartment instead of my own home. When the elevator doors opened on our floor, the hallway carpet looked freshly vacuumed, the kind of careful touch that is meant to look like nothing happened, which is exactly what it looks like when something happened. I walked to our door, unlocked it, stepped inside, and took in the quiet that hit my ears first, then my skin, then the part of my brain that keeps score even when I pretend I am a better man. The lights were off, the thermostat was set lower than Elena usually liked, and the kitchen smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something sweeter underneath, something that did not belong to detergent or candles, something that belonged to nerves. I put my bag down slowly, like sudden movement might disturb whatever fragile arrangement had been made, and I listened for the small sounds of a person at home, a footstep, a drawer, a sigh, the tiny betrayals of ordinary living. There was nothing, and nothing is a kind of answer when you know someone should be there. Elena's keys were not on the hook, her shoes were not by the entry mat, and the throw blanket on the couch was folded with a neatness she never bothered with unless company was coming. I walked to the bedroom and stopped in the doorway, because the bed was made in a way that felt performative, smooth, and tight, with the pillows squared like a magazine photo, which would have been sweet if it had been for me. But I had not told her I was coming home, and she had not had time to do anything for me. I set my fingers on the duvet, pressed lightly, and felt the coolness that told me nobody had been under it for hours, because sheets remember bodies for longer than people remember promises. A pulse of irritation rose in my throat, not loud enough to become anger, but sharp enough to cut, and I swallowed it down, because anger is a gift you hand to the wrong person when the room is already rigged. I could have called her, but phone calls are messy, and I needed clean, because clean is what survives when lies start multiplying. So I texted her, simple and mild, like a husband who is polite enough to be fooled. I wrote that I got back early, and I asked where she was, and I stared at the screen while the message sent, because I already felt the shape of the answer forming in the air like a storm front. Her reply came fast, too fast for someone who was surprised, and it read, "I'm in our bed." I stared at it, and felt that strange twist in my chest you get when a lie is too bold, because bold lies do not want to be questioned. They want to be accepted the way you accept bad weather. I stood in front of the bed, looked at the tight corners and the untouched sheets, and I could have typed a dozen things, any of them emotional, any of them accusatory, any of them useful to her if she wanted to build a story where I was dramatic and unstable. Instead, I chose the smallest truth I could hold in my hand. I sat on the edge of the mattress and took a selfie that showed my face and the bed behind me, smooth as a frozen lake, and I sent it with 2 words that felt like a match struck in a dark room. This bed? I did not add punctuation, because punctuation is polite, and I was not in a polite mood. But I also did not add anger, because anger would have made it a fight, and I did not want a fight. I wanted reality. For a moment there was nothing, and I sat there listening to the quiet of our bedroom, the distant hum of the building's ventilation, the faint traffic beyond the windows, and the thud of my own heartbeat, steady enough to keep me from doing something stupid. Then I saw the typing indicator appear and disappear again, like a person walking back and forth in a room trying to choose the right mask. Her next message came slower, and it was suddenly casual, suddenly playful, suddenly full of words meant to paint over a hole. "You're back already?" I meant I'm in bed, like in bed at home. I'm almost there. The lie had shifted from location to language, which is what liars do when the first version gets punctured, and I felt something in me settle into a cold clarity that scared me more than rage ever could. I did not reply, because I had already said enough, and because silence is the space where people hang themselves with their own rope if you let them. I stood up, walked to the living room, and moved like I was alone, because if I started acting like a detective, I would become the villain in her story. I noticed a faint line of dampness on the bathroom counter, as if someone had washed hands in a hurry, and I noticed the trash can under the sink looked freshly emptied, a clean mouth with nothing inside it, which is never a good sign. I opened the closet by the entryway and saw that Elena's jacket was missing, which fit with her claim she was out, but did not fit with her claim she was in our bed, and the contradiction sat there like a toothache. I walked back into the bedroom and looked again at the pillows, because pillows are honest in a way people are not, and one pillow had been fluffed more than the other, as if someone had leaned on one side and tried to fix it quickly. I took out my phone, opened my notes app, and wrote the times down with the precision I use at work when I certify something that will matter later. Her first claim, my selfie, her pivot, the gap in between. I was not doing it to trap her, I told myself. I was doing it to protect myself, and the difference is thin enough to cut. 20 minutes passed with the kind of tension that makes ordinary seconds feel like heavy objects, and then I heard the elevator doors down the hall, fast footsteps, and the key in the lock scraping like she missed the groove the first time. The door flew open, and Elena came in like a gust of panic wrapped in perfume, cheeks slightly flushed, hair a little too neat to be natural, eyes wide with the kind of urgency that is meant to look like concern, but reads as fear when you know how to read. She stopped when she saw me standing there, because she had expected me to be moving, searching, accusing, doing something she could point to later as proof of my instability. Instead, I was still, and stillness is hard to argue with. She laughed too loudly, the laugh of someone trying to set a tone, and she said the words that always come first when a person is trying to reframe reality. "What are you doing home?" I let my face soften just enough to look like a tired husband, not a suspicious one, and I asked her calmly why she said she was in our bed if she was out of the building. She blinked, and there it was, the tiny pause where the brain reaches for a story that fits the new information, and she went for the easiest one, the one that makes you feel guilty for questioning. "I thought you meant later," she said. "I was joking. You know how I talk." She stepped forward, kissed my cheek quickly, and the kiss felt like a stamp on a document she wanted to file away as truth. I did not pull away, because pulling away would have been a reaction, and she wanted reactions. She needed reactions, because reactions give her something to hold up to other people. I asked her where she had been, and she said she was running an errand, and she said it with the same tone she uses when she orders coffee, which is to say, practiced and light. I asked what errand, and she said she had to pick something up, and she moved toward the kitchen, as if the geography of the apartment could change the shape of the conversation. I followed, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be disengaged, and I watched her hands as she opened the fridge, then closed it without taking anything, because she did not know what she was doing, she just needed something to do. I asked her again what she picked up, and she said she grabbed a package and she started talking about shipping delays and building management like the details would make it real. I nodded slowly, and I asked which package, because if she had truly picked up a package, she could name it. And if she could not name it, then the story was an empty envelope. Her eyes flashed, just for a second, with irritation, and she said, "Why are you interrogating me, Miles? I missed you." The shift was clean, from facts to feelings, which is always the move when facts are thin. I told her I missed her too, because I did, in the way you miss someone you thought you knew, and then I said I was tired and needed a shower, because I needed to end the first round without giving her more material. She followed me to the bedroom, asked if everything was okay, and the sweetness in her voice tasted like medicine you swallow because you do not want to admit you are sick. I told her everything was fine, and I meant it in the narrow sense that I was not going to explode. And then I watched her eyes track my phone when it lit up from a notification, and I watched her pretend not to watch. That one glance, that small betrayal of attention, told me more than any confession would have, because a person who is innocent does not track a phone like it is a live grenade. I went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and stood under the water without moving, letting it run over my head while my thoughts lined up like documents on a desk. I did not have proof, not yet, and I did not know what she was hiding, not exactly, but I knew she was hiding something, because people do not panic like that over a simple misunderstanding. When I came out, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling her phone with the brightness turned low, and she looked up too quickly when she heard me, as if she had been waiting for me to catch her doing something. She asked me about my trip, about my meetings, about the highway, and the questions came rapid and eager, the way people talk when they need to fill space before someone else speaks. I answered lightly, gave her enough to sound normal, and watched how she reacted to ordinary details. When I mentioned that I had planned to come back tomorrow but the last meeting ended early, I saw her shoulders drop half an inch, not in relief, but in recalculation, as if a schedule she had in her head just got rewritten. That was when I understood that the early return did not just surprise her. It ruined something that had a time slot. She reached for me, tried to pull me into bed, tried to turn the night into a scene of reconnection that would wash away the stain of the earlier texts. But intimacy used as a sponge is still a sponge, and I was not interested in cleaning up her mess with my body. I kissed her forehead, told her I was exhausted, and lay down facing the other direction, listening to her breathe behind me, listening to her breathing change as she realized I was not going to play along. In the dark, her phone buzzed once, a small vibration that might have been anything, and she lifted it with a careful slowness that felt like stealth. I did not turn, did not ask, did not accuse, and I let my silence sit between us like a third person. A few minutes later, she got out of bed, walked into the living room, and I heard the faint murmur of her voice, low and urgent, the way someone sounds when they think they can keep a secret by whispering. I stared at the wall and counted the seconds, because that is what you do when you are choosing who you are going to be next. I could have walked out there and caught her mid-call, could have forced a confession, could have lit the whole thing on fire in one bright moment. But fire makes smoke, and smoke makes stories, and stories are where liars win. So I stayed still, and I let her talk, and I decided that whatever this was, I was going to win it the way I win everything that matters. Slowly, cleanly, and with receipts. By morning, Elena was acting like the previous night had been a minor glitch, the kind of harmless confusion couples laugh about later, and she tried to sell that idea with pancakes, bright smiles, and a voice that sounded just a little too cheerful, like a radio host performing happiness into a microphone. I sat at the table with coffee I could barely taste, watched her move around the kitchen with unnecessary energy, and noticed she avoided looking directly at my phone because she had looked at it enough the night before to make that fear stick in her mind. She asked me if I slept okay, and I said I slept fine, because I did, in the sense that my body rested while my brain built a file cabinet. She brought my plate, leaned in for a kiss, and held it a moment too long, as if affection could be used like tape over a crack, and I let her kiss me, because I did not want to give her proof of emotional withdrawal. That is the first rule of surviving someone else's narrative. Do not hand them the scene they want to describe to others. Elena was good at stories, and she had friends who liked stories, and in a building like ours, stories were currency, traded in elevators and mailrooms and hallways, paid out in sympathy, collected in favors, cashed in when someone needed an audience. I had lived in this place long enough to know who ran the gossip pipeline, who whispered to whom, who smiled while taking notes, and who pretended to be neutral while picking a side. Elena was social, which meant she was powerful in a soft way, and soft power is the kind that kills you politely. I cleaned the dishes after breakfast, because doing the ordinary makes you look stable, and stability is armor when someone wants to paint you as the problem. Elena watched me from the doorway and said she was going to run to the gym, and she said it quickly, as if she needed to be out of the apartment before my calm became dangerous. I told her to have a good workout, and she blinked, surprised by how normal I sounded, because she had expected a hangover of suspicion. As soon as she left, I sat down at the table, opened my notebook, and wrote the timeline of the night before in plain language, with times and short descriptions, like a man documenting a minor car accident before the other driver changes their story. I wrote her first text, her claim, my selfie, her delayed pivot, her entry time, her first explanation, the way she tried to shift the argument to feelings, the moment her phone buzzed in bed, the whisper call in the living room. Then I signed the bottom of the page because signatures are simple, and simple things hold up when people start screaming. I was not a private investigator, and I was not going to become one, because I had no interest in chasing shadows across the city like a man in a cheap movie. My job had taught me something better than chasing, something quieter and sharper. You do not need to know every detail to prove a lie. You just need to show the lie next to one stubborn fact that refuses to move. When Elena came home 2 hours later, she walked in with that post-workout glow that usually meant she felt proud, but today it looked more like she was trying to wear innocence like a costume. She asked if I wanted to grab lunch somewhere, and I said I already ate, which was true, and I watched her flinch as if my refusal had been a slap. She asked what I did while she was gone, and I said I caught up on emails, and I watched her face search for something to accuse me of. It was subtle, like watching someone reach for a weapon and come up empty. She tried a different angle, something gentle, something designed to pull me into a private conversation where she could cry and make me the villain. She said she felt like I did not trust her, and she said it with a soft tremble in her voice, the kind that makes decent men apologize. I told her that trust is not a speech, it is a habit, and I left it there, because I was not going to argue about trust with a woman who had just told me she was in our bed while she was out in the world doing something she did not want named. Her eyes hardened for a moment, then she smiled again, and that quick switch made my stomach turn, because it was the smile of a person who realizes kindness will not work and decides to save it for an audience. Over the next few days, she watched me like a cat watches a slow-moving hand, suspicious of what it might do, and she tried to pull information out of me in indirect ways. She would ask about my schedule, about when I was going into the office, about whether I planned to attend the next building meeting, about whether I had talked to anyone in the lobby, and every question had the same polite wrapper and the same sharp hook inside. I answered lightly, stayed routine, kept my tone even, and I made sure I was seen in ordinary places at ordinary times, because if she was preparing to paint me as unstable, I was going to give her the opposite canvas. One evening, while we were waiting for the elevator, Nolan Pike stepped out of the stairwell and greeted Elena with a familiarity that made me pause, not because neighbors cannot be friendly, but because his smile looked like a man who knows something and wants credit for knowing it. He said hello to me too, but his eyes lingered on Elena, and Elena's laughter rose half a note higher than normal, which is the sound people make when they are playing for approval. Nolan mentioned, casually, that he saw her earlier near the mailroom, that she looked like she was in a hurry, and he said it like a joke, but jokes are often the safest way to deliver information. Elena's shoulders tightened, and she said she was always in a hurry these days because life was busy, and Nolan nodded with an exaggerated sympathy that felt performative. I could see Elena trying to decide whether Nolan was dangerous or useful, and I could see Nolan enjoying being in the middle of something, because small men love being gatekeepers of big stories. When we got into the elevator, Elena pressed the button for our floor too hard, and when the doors closed, she whispered that Nolan was weird, that people in this building had no boundaries, and that she hated feeling watched. I said I understood, and I meant it in a way she would not like if she knew. The next morning, I went down to get the mail earlier than usual, because I wanted to see what the lobby looked like when Elena was not there to manage it. The front desk clerk gave me a polite nod, and I noticed the way his eyes moved from my face to my ring and back again, the kind of glance that suggests he has heard something he did not say. I walked to the mailroom, scanned the bulletin board, and my eyes landed on a new notice about an HOA compliance reminder, posted in a neat font with the board's logo at the top. The notice was generic, the kind of thing that could apply to anyone, but there was a thin edge to the language, an emphasis on resident conduct and community harmony, the kind of phrasing people use when they want to sound neutral while pointing a finger. I tore off my own mail, and as I turned to leave, Nolan appeared like he had been waiting for a scene. He said good morning, then asked, too casually, if everything was okay at home, because he heard Elena was upset yesterday. I did not take the bait, and I did not ask what he heard or who told him, because questions feed gossip like oxygen feeds flame. I smiled and said we were fine, and I thanked him for checking in, and I watched his disappointment flicker, because fine is a closed door. Nolan leaned closer anyway, and said he was sure Elena was under a lot of stress, and that the board chair, Grant Dorsey, had offered to help if she needed anything, because Grant cared about residents. The name landed in my mind with a heavy thud, not because I knew him well, but because everyone in the building knew of him. The man who spoke like a judge at meetings, the man who loved rules until rules applied to him, the man who treated the HOA like a private kingdom, and the rest of us like tenants on his land. Nolan said Grant was always stepping in to handle issues before they became bigger issues, and he smiled like he was proud to be associated with that power. I nodded, thanked him again, and left before my face could show what my brain was doing. Back upstairs, I sat at the table, opened my notebook, and wrote Grant Dorsey's name on a clean page with a line under it, because now I had a shape for the shadow. The story was still missing pieces, and I still did not know who Elena had been with on that first night. But I knew one thing with certainty. She was not just lying to me. She was managing a system around us. Systems are where small lies become big consequences, and I have never trusted a system that runs on whispers. That afternoon, Elena came home with a bright mood that felt forced, and she told me she had been asked to help with a community initiative, something about improving resident engagement, and she spoke with the kind of enthusiasm that is meant to make you proud. I asked her who asked her, and she said the board, and she said it too quickly, and I watched her eyes flick toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to overhear and approve. I asked her which board member, and she laughed and said I was being paranoid, and she called me adorable, the way you call a dog adorable when it barks at a stranger. I did not argue, because arguing would have been proof she could use later, and instead I said it sounded like a lot, and I asked when the next HOA meeting was scheduled, and the question changed the temperature of the room. Elena's smile tightened, and she asked why I cared, and I said I wanted to be involved, because it is my home too. She told me there was no need, that those meetings were boring, that Grant handled everything, that she would fill me in, and then she changed the subject to dinner plans, like the board was a door she wanted to keep closed. That night, while she showered, her phone lit up on the bedside table with a preview I did not touch, did not open, did not chase, because I do not steal what I can earn cleanly, and the preview showed a single line of text with a time and a place. Lobby, 10. I stared at the glow until it faded, and I felt my pulse slow into something colder. I took out my own phone, opened my notes, and wrote down exactly what I saw, and the time I saw it. And I signed the line with my initials, because if Elena wanted to build a story, I was going to build a ledger. When she came out of the bathroom, she saw my phone in my hand and asked what I was doing, and I told her I was making a list for work, and she nodded. But her eyes stayed on my screen a second too long. She got into bed, curled close, and whispered that she loved me, and I told her I loved her too, because love is not the same thing as trust, and I was still a man who could love even while preparing for a war he did not want. I lay there in the dark, listening to the building settle, listening to her breathing change as sleep approached, and I thought about that first lie, the one that started it all, the text that said she was in our bed. It was such a stupid lie, so easily disproved, that it could only mean one thing. She thought she could control me, and control is always the first sin in a marriage that is about to die. I decided then, quietly, that I would not confront her in private again, not until I had something that would survive in daylight. I would collect small truths. I would document them with clean hands, and I would let the weight of those truths do the work. Because when a person builds their life on stories, the cruelest justice is not shouting, it is proof. The next morning, I woke before Elena, not because I was disciplined, but because my mind refused to sleep in a house that suddenly felt like it had thin walls and hidden doors. I lay there for a minute, listening to the building's low mechanical hum and the faint rush of water from some neighbor's shower, and I watched Elena's face in the dim light, calm and soft the way it used to look when I believed her life made sense. Her phone was on the nightstand again, face down this time, like she had learned a lesson without understanding why the lesson mattered. I got up quietly, made coffee, and moved through the kitchen with deliberate normalcy, because normal is camouflage when a marriage turns into a contest of narratives. The sun was barely up, and the windows threw a pale rectangle across the counter, catching dust motes that drifted like slow snow, and I found myself staring at them with a strange resentment, as if even the air was allowed to move freely while I was stuck in place. Elena woke to the smell of coffee and walked in wearing one of my old shirts, which should have been tender, but the tenderness felt staged now, like a costume from a happier season. She kissed my cheek, asked if I had plans for the day, and her voice had that lightness people use when they are checking for danger without wanting to sound like they are checking. I told her I had some work errands, nothing major, and I watched her relax by a fraction, which told me she had wanted to hear that I would be gone. She asked if I wanted to come down with her later, maybe go for a walk, maybe see the lobby renovation plans the HOA had posted, and she said it as if she was inviting me into the community, but her eyes were careful, measuring. I said maybe, kept my tone mild, and let her think she was steering. She moved around the kitchen, pulled out yogurt, then put it back, then opened a cabinet as if she forgot what lived inside it, and I recognized the restlessness of a person holding too many plates at once. When she finally sat, she asked if everything was okay between us, and the question came with the softest tone, the kind that tries to sound caring while hiding a hook. I told her everything was fine, because fine is a word that gives nothing away, and I asked how her day looked, because I wanted her to speak without me pushing. She said she had the gym, then a quick meeting for community stuff, then she might grab coffee with Ray, and she said Ray's name like it was a shield, like friendship could legitimize any gap in time. I nodded, took a sip of coffee, and asked what the community meeting was about. She smiled too brightly and said it was just planning, nothing worth boring me with. And then she changed the subject to my trip, to the weather, to anything that wasn't time and place. I let her change it, because I was not hunting a confession. I was building a structure that could not be blown down by tears. After breakfast, she left with her gym bag slung over one shoulder, looking like a woman with a routine, and I waited until the door closed before I touched my notebook. I wrote the day's declared schedule down, not because I believed it, but because declared schedules are the easiest things to compare to reality later. I kept my notes plain, almost dull, because drama in a ledger reads like emotion, and emotion is the first thing people dismiss when you want them to see truth. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, loaded the dishwasher, wiped the counter, and did the kind of domestic chores that make you look harmless. Then I grabbed my keys and went downstairs, because I had decided that if I was going to be forced into this role, I would do it like a professional, not like a jealous man with a bad stomach. The lobby was quiet. The front desk clerk was there as usual, and I gave him a nod as if I was simply another resident starting his day. I walked toward the mailroom, not because I had mail, but because the mailroom was a small public stage where people liked to pass through and be seen. On the bulletin board, I noticed a fresh flyer about an upcoming HOA hearing, something about conduct standards and resident harmony, the same thinly sharp language I had seen before. The flyer was posted neatly, aligned with the corner of the board like someone cared about appearances, and that attention to appearances felt like Grant's signature. A few minutes later, Nolan appeared, as if summoned by the scent of possible conflict, and he greeted me with a grin that tried to be friendly and landed as hungry. He asked how Elena was doing, said she seemed stressed, said she had so much on her plate, and he delivered each sentence like he was placing a coin into a collection box of gossip. I told him Elena was fine, thanked him for checking in, and I kept walking, because the fastest way to starve a man like Nolan is to deny him the scene he wants. He followed anyway, drifting beside me like a persistent insect, and he mentioned that Grant was really stepping up lately, that Grant was trying to help people, that Grant had a good heart beneath the strict rules. Nolan said that the board was tired of incidents, and he used that word like it had a history I was supposed to know. I asked what incidents calmly, as if I was just curious, and Nolan's eyes lit up because he finally had an invitation. He said there had been complaints about noise, about late visitors, about residents arguing in the hallways, and he said it all like he was describing weather, neutral and inevitable. I nodded, acted mildly concerned, and I asked whether those complaints were official. Nolan shrugged and said Grant was keeping things under control, and he lowered his voice as if we were sharing a secret, and he told me that Elena had been helping the board with resident engagement, which was a fancy phrase for collecting social leverage. I thanked him again, told him I had to get going, and I left him standing there with his mouth slightly open, still wanting to talk, still wanting to be important. Outside the building, the air was cold and clean, and I walked toward the corner cafe where the staff knew me by name, because routine places have routine witnesses, and routine witnesses are the safest kind. I ordered coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street with a calm I did not feel. I kept my phone on the table, screen dark, but I kept my mind awake. I was not tailing Elena, not stalking, not doing anything that could be described as predatory, because that would give her the moral high ground she was trying to build. Instead, I was doing what I had always done when something mattered. I was paying attention to systems. If Elena was meeting someone, she had to pass through the same doors, the same elevators, the same public spaces, and she had to leave the same small traces people always leave when they think the world forgets them. An hour later, I returned to the building and took the stairs to our floor, because I wanted to avoid the elevator cameras and the lobby eyes, not because I feared being seen, but because I wanted to control what could be interpreted later. When I entered the apartment, the silence greeted me again, and I noticed that Elena's perfume lingered in the hallway, fresh enough to suggest she had sprayed before leaving, the way people do when they want to smell like they have been somewhere respectable. I went to the kitchen table, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and started building a simple ledger. Date, time, claim, observed fact, source of fact. I wrote like a man preparing a file for a dull office dispute, because dull is the disguise of truth. Then I opened our shared calendar, the one Elena claimed not to use, and I exported the week view as a PDF, because if she edited anything later, I wanted a snapshot of what it looked like today. I saved it to my own device, printed it on our home printer, and watched the printer spit out the pages with that faint smell of ink and warm paper, a smell that felt like control returning to my hands. That afternoon, Elena came home earlier than her declared schedule, and she walked in with a smile that was just a little too bright for someone who had spent time on a treadmill. She set her gym bag down, kissed me quickly, and started talking fast, telling me about a planning session that went longer than expected, telling me about Ray's opinion on a new restaurant, telling me about a neighbor who complained about recycling bins, and every detail felt like it had been chosen to sound domestic and harmless. I listened, nodded at the right places, and when she paused to breathe, I asked a single question about the planning session. Just one, and I asked it softly. She answered with an answer that was nearly accurate, almost convincing, but she added an unnecessary detail about a time slot that did not match the exported calendar printout on the table. Her eyes flicked to the paper the moment she realized the mismatch existed, and she tried to cover it with a laugh, making a joke about me being organized. I smiled back, made a light comment about schedules being messy, and I watched her shoulders loosen as she believed I had not noticed. The truth was, I had noticed, and I had logged it, and I had not needed to raise my voice once. That night, after dinner, Elena suggested we go down to the lobby to look at the renovation board, and she pushed the idea with enough enthusiasm to make it suspicious. I agreed, because refusing would have been a signal, and I was not interested in giving her any signal she could interpret as weakness. We rode the elevator down together, and she leaned into me, smiling at the security mirror like she wanted the building to see us as a couple. In the lobby, Nolan was there again, and Grant Dorsey was there too, standing near the bulletin board with two other residents, talking in a low, authoritative tone, his posture squared like he owned the air. Grant was taller than I expected, with a clean haircut and a smile that felt like a polished knife. When Elena saw him, her expression shifted in a way she probably thought was invisible, a quick flash of alertness and something else, something warmer. Then she smoothed it into friendliness. Grant greeted her first, by name, with ease, then turned to me with a polite nod like I was an accessory. He asked how my trip was, and the fact that he knew I had been on a trip made my stomach tighten, because it meant Elena had been discussing my schedule with him as if it was community property. I told him it was fine, thanked him for asking, and I kept my tone calm, because calm makes controlling men nervous. Grant said he was glad I was back, because the building valued stable households, and the way he said stable sounded like a threat disguised as praise. Elena laughed lightly, said Grant was always joking, and Nolan chuckled too, eager to be part of the moment. Grant then mentioned casually that the board had received some complaints lately, and he hoped residents would be mindful of visitor policies because the community had standards. He looked at me when he said it, not at Elena, and that told me something important about the shape of the game. He wanted me to react, because if I reacted, he could paint me as the problem in front of witnesses. I did not react. I nodded once, thanked him for the reminder, and asked when the next board hearing was scheduled, because I wanted to stay informed. Grant's smile tightened by a fraction, and Elena's eyes widened slightly, because I had stepped into their territory without raising my voice. Grant said the hearing dates were posted, and he gestured toward the board like a man granting permission. I walked to the notice, read it slowly, and I saw the date for a Conduct and Community Harmony hearing set for later in the month. I memorized it, then took a photo of the notice with my phone in plain view, because public notices are meant to be documented, and there is nothing suspicious about photographing something posted for everyone. Elena stiffened beside me, but she forced a laugh and said I was so thorough, and Nolan made a joke about me being a lawyer, and I smiled as if it was all harmless. Inside, I felt the first real click of certainty. Grant was involved, and the building was the arena, and Elena's lie about being in our bed was just the opening move. When we got back upstairs, Elena tried to coax me into intimacy again, tried to soften the tension with touch, tried to make the night blur into something that could be remembered as normal. I did not reject her, because rejection is a weapon she could use, but I did not give her what she wanted either, because what she wanted was to wash the day clean. I told her I was tired, that I wanted to sleep, and I turned off the light. In the dark, I listened as she shifted, sighed, then reached for her phone. The screen glow painted her face a pale blue, and I did not look directly, but I saw enough to know she was texting. A minute later, her phone buzzed again, and she sat up, and she whispered something into the darkness like she forgot I was there. Then she got out of bed and walked toward the living room. Again and again, I heard the low murmur of her voice. This time I did not stay still. I waited until her footsteps softened, then I got up quietly, walked to the bedroom doorway, and watched from the shadow of the hall. Elena stood near the window, her back to me, phone to her ear, shoulders tense. I did not hear full words, but I heard tone, and the tone was not the tone of a woman talking to her friend about brunch. It was the tone of urgency, of coordination, of damage control. I stepped back into the bedroom without making noise, returned to bed, and I stared at the ceiling until she came back, slipping under the sheets with exaggerated quiet, like she believed silence erased action. When her breathing finally slowed, I reached for my notebook on the nightstand, opened it under the cover of darkness, and wrote a single line. Second whisper call. Same pattern, same fear. I did not need content to prove pattern. Pattern was enough. A week passed with the kind of tense normalcy that makes you feel like you are living inside someone else's routine, smiling at small talk, while your mind keeps a separate calendar. Elena behaved like a woman trying to prove she was unbothered, and the harder she tried, the more obvious it became that she was bothered. She started picking small fights over harmless things, dishes left in the sink, laundry not folded right, my tone when I said good morning, because if she could make me the source of conflict, she could justify whatever she was doing outside the apartment. I did not take the bait. I apologized when apologies cost me nothing. I fixed what needed fixing, and I stayed calm, because calm is acid to a person trying to make you look volatile. Ray came by twice, once with wine and a smile, once with a coffee carrier and a tight expression that screamed agenda. Both times, she treated me like I was a piece of furniture, polite but irrelevant, and she spoke to Elena in that coded language friends use when they assume husbands are too dull to understand. I understood, and I let them underestimate me because underestimation is a gift when you are building a case. On day 9, a merchant notification popped up on my phone, one of those routine alerts tied to my own account, and it showed a small charge from a place Elena claimed she never went, a boutique hotel cafe across town where I had once met a client. The charge was not huge, but it had a timestamp, and timestamps are more valuable than amounts. I stared at the alert, felt my jaw tighten, and then I did what I had been training myself to do. I took a screenshot, wrote the time down, and kept my face neutral when Elena walked into the room. She asked what I was looking at, and I told her I had a billing notification, and she rolled her eyes like finances bored her. The moment she dismissed it told me she was not thinking about that account the way she should have been, which meant she was careless, and careless people make mistakes you can document. Later that day, when Elena said she was meeting Ray for coffee, she mentioned a different cafe, one near the gym, and she dropped the name casually as if it was a strong anchor. I nodded, told her to have fun, and after she left, I compared the time of her claimed coffee to the time of the hotel cafe charge. The overlap was not perfect, but it was close enough to squeeze. It suggested she had been at the hotel cafe first, then had adjusted her story to sound more ordinary. I wrote that down too, because you cannot build justice on one brick, but you can build it on a wall of small bricks stacked cleanly. The lobby started feeling different, like the air carried faint commentary. The front desk clerk's nod became more cautious, the doorman's greeting became slightly formal, and Nolan's friendliness sharpened into something like surveillance. One afternoon, as I waited for the elevator, Nolan joined me and said he heard there might be a conduct review coming up, and he said it with a smile that tried to look concerned. I asked what he meant, and he shrugged, then said the board was serious about standards, and he hoped nobody was bringing drama into the building. The way he said drama made it sound like entertainment, like he was hoping for it, and I realized Nolan was not just a gossip, he was a messenger, a little courier for Grant's influence. I nodded, thanked him for the update, and I said I hoped the board focused on facts, because facts help everyone. Nolan laughed awkwardly, as if facts were an inconvenient preference, and I watched him glance toward the security mirror near the elevator. That glance told me he was aware of optics, which meant someone had instructed him to care about optics. That evening, Elena came home late, later than her declared schedule, and she walked in with an energy that was slightly off, too bright and too brittle. She told me she got caught up with Ray, that they talked for hours, that time got away, and she said it like she was reciting a rehearsed explanation. I asked her gently what they talked about, and she said work stress, relationships, and something about the HOA meeting and the inclusion of the HOA. Felt like she was trying to normalize the board's presence in our lives. I nodded, said that sounded like Ray, and I asked one simple question. What time did she leave the cafe? Elena answered, then corrected herself, then laughed at herself, and the laughter sounded forced. I did not correct her. I let her correction hang, because corrections are where people expose their fear. Later, when she went to shower, I opened the shared calendar again and saw a community planning placeholder added, then deleted, then added again, the kind of jittery editing that happens when someone is trying to create an alibi trail. I exported the week view again, saved it, printed it, and filed it in my growing folder of paper, because paper is heavy in a way digital things are not. The first real fracture came at a family dinner, not because I planned it that way, but because family dinners have a gravity that makes lies wobble. Elena insisted we host, insisted we be seen as normal, insisted on inviting her cousin and one of my relatives, plus Ray, because Ray always wanted an audience. I agreed, because public spaces are where liars lose control if you stay calm. Elena cooked too much food, fussed too much, made the table look too perfect, and perfection is often a warning sign. During dinner, Ray steered the conversation toward healthy boundaries, toward control, toward trust, using the kind of therapeutic language people learn online and weaponize in real life. She asked me, with a sweet smile, whether I ever worried about being too rigid, and she asked it like she was concerned for Elena, not like she was attacking me. I smiled back, said I believed in clarity, and then I asked Elena softly what time she had been in our bed the night I returned. The question was simple, and it was not asked like an accusation. It was asked like a neutral attempt at closure. Elena froze for a second, then laughed, then said I was still stuck on that misunderstanding, and she insisted it was a joke, a shorthand, a silly mistake. Ray jumped in quickly, saying I should let it go, that couples miscommunicate, that I was making it bigger than it was. I nodded, acted like I accepted the framing, and I asked Elena one more question, again softly, about what errand she was running when she said she was in bed. Elena answered with the package story again, and this time her cousin tilted her head slightly, as if something did not fit. I did not press. I watched. Elena's cousin asked casually what package it was, and Elena hesitated too long before saying it was nothing important. That hesitation was not proof, but it was witness friction, and witness friction is the beginning of collapse. After dinner, when people stood up and moved toward the living room, I stayed at the table and pulled out my notebook, not like a dramatic reveal, but like a man checking a grocery list. I wrote down the time of Elena's hesitation, the cousin's question, Ray's interruption, and I did it in plain view. Ray saw me, and her smile tightened because she realized I was not emotionally spiraling, I was documenting. Elena followed my gaze, saw the notebook, and her face flashed with anger so fast it could be denied later. She walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder too firmly, and asked what I was writing. I told her I was planning the week, and I asked her, lightly, whether the next HOA hearing date was still the same. The question landed like a stone in water. Ray's eyes flicked to Elena. Elena's cousin looked confused. My relative stared at Elena's face as if seeing it differently for the first time. Elena laughed, too loudly, said I was joking, and she said the HOA stuff was boring, and I nodded as if I agreed. Then I excused myself to take out the trash, because I needed a moment to breathe in a hallway that did not smell like performance. In the hallway, I stood by the trash chute and stared at the metal door, listening to the building's quiet, and I felt the tightness in my chest that comes when you realize you are not just fighting your spouse, you are fighting a social network. Elena had allies, and those allies were already shaping the story, casting me as suspicious, controlling, unstable, while casting her as stressed, overwhelmed, misunderstood. That kind of story can ruin you without a single hard fact, because people like easy narratives and cold husband spirals is easier than wife lies and panics. I understood then that if I wanted justice, I would need something more than my own certainty. I would need a public record, a process, a setting where facts mattered more than charm. Grant's arena was the building, which meant my arena would have to be the building too, but not on his terms. I needed a hearing, minutes, a formal entry of evidence, something that could not be rewritten in a group chat later. The next day, I went to the HOA office, not as a furious husband, but as a resident requesting information. The office was a small room off the lobby, with filing cabinets and a desk, and a board calendar on the wall. A woman sat behind the desk, late 30s maybe, with sharp eyes and a posture that said she survived by insisting on rules. Her nameplate read, Lila Kent, Board Secretary. I introduced myself, gave my unit number, and told her I wanted to understand the conduct hearing process because I had concerns about accuracy in complaints. Lila listened without smiling, then said the board took complaints seriously, that they required documentation, and that hearings were formal. I told her I appreciated formality, and I asked whether minutes were recorded. She said yes, minutes were recorded, and she said it like it mattered to her personally. I asked whether residents could submit written statements or evidence packets, and she said yes, but evidence had to be relevant and lawful. I nodded, told her that was exactly my preference, and I asked how to request that the minutes reflect evidence received in the room. Lila paused, looked at me more carefully, and then said that if evidence was submitted, it would be noted, and she could type it live on the projector during hearings. The mention of a projector surprised me, and I felt the first real clean line appear in my mind. If the minutes could be projected, then truth could be witnessed as it entered the record. Lila told me hearing dates were posted, and she pointed to the calendar, and I thanked her and left without adding anything personal. Back upstairs, Elena was waiting with a smile that looked brittle. She asked where I had been, and I told her I ran a quick errand in the building. She asked what kind of errand, and I said I checked on some HOA dates because I wanted to stay informed. Her face tightened, and she asked why I was suddenly interested, and I told her I liked clarity. She tried to laugh it off, then tried to pivot into affection, then tried to pivot into irritation, cycling masks fast enough that a stranger might miss it. But I did not miss it. She told me I was making things weird, that we should focus on us, that she felt judged, that she felt watched, and she said watched like it was my fault, even though she was the one watching me. I told her I was focusing on us, and that focusing on us meant truth, and I said it softly enough that she could not call it aggression. She stared at me for a long moment, then smiled again, and she walked away like the conversation did not exist. That was when I knew, with a clarity that made my hands steady, that the next phase was coming. She was going to escalate, because calm men force liars to either confess or attack, and Elena was not a confessor. That night, as we lay in bed, her phone buzzed again, and she rolled over too fast, shielding the screen. I did not ask. I did not move. I simply opened my notebook in the dark and wrote down the time, because time was becoming my sharpest weapon. Elena whispered that she loved me, and I said I loved her too, because love is not leverage for me. Then she whispered that we should take a weekend trip, just the two of us, to reset, to reconnect, to stop the weirdness. I told her I would think about it, and I felt her body relax in relief because she believed she had found a way to move the stage away from the building and away from witnesses. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and I understood that her proposed trip was not romance. It was relocation of the battlefield, and I had no intention of letting her choose the battlefield again. Elena's idea of a weekend trip sounded like romance on the surface, but it carried the same scent as that first lie, the scent of someone trying to move the chessboard when the pieces are already in trouble. She brought it up again the next morning, over coffee, in the casual tone people use when they want their request to feel inevitable, and she kept calling it a reset, as if my calm was a malfunction and not a choice. She listed towns within driving distance, mentioned a hotel with a spa, suggested we unplug and ignore everyone, and every time she said everyone, her eyes flicked toward the hallway like the building itself was a witness she wanted to evade. I told her the idea sounded nice, and I told her my schedule might be tight because a gentle maybe keeps a person hopeful while you prepare the ground under their feet. She smiled, relieved, and she touched my hand as if the touch could seal my compliance, but her fingers were colder than usual, and cold hands are never a good omen in a warm kitchen. The week moved forward with a strange two-track rhythm, one track being our outward domestic routine, and the other track being the quiet construction project inside my head. I kept going to work, kept showing up at the cafe, kept greeting the doorman, kept nodding at the front desk clerk. Because stability is not a personality trait, it is an alibi when someone is preparing to accuse you of being unstable. Elena became more attentive in public and more irritated in private, which is a common pattern for people who need the crowd to believe one thing while they wrestle another thing at home. She started leaving little compliments around the apartment like breadcrumbs, praising me for being organized, praising me for being patient, praising me for being a good husband, and each compliment felt like a marker she could point to later and say, "She tried." That is how people build a defense before they launch an attack, and it told me the attack was already drafted in someone's head, maybe hers, maybe Ray's, maybe Grant's, and maybe all three. On day 12, another merchant notification hit my phone, and it was small enough to look harmless until you lined it up next to the rest. The merchant was a mid-tier restaurant near the boutique hotel cafe. The timestamp was early afternoon, and the amount was exactly the kind of amount you spend when you are trying to look casual while still ordering something nice. I took the screenshot immediately, then opened my notebook and wrote the time down with a steady hand. The calmness I felt in that moment surprised me, because I expected rage, but rage requires surprise, and I had already passed the point of surprise. This was not about catching her in the act anymore. It was about proving a pattern without violating my own rules. I did not touch her phone. I did not access accounts that were not mine. I did not follow her around like a desperate man. I simply collected the traces that belonged to my life, because marriage is shared enough that the truth usually leaks into your own pocket eventually. Elena came home that evening carrying a takeout bag like a peace offering, smiling like a woman who expected applause for doing the bare minimum, and she told me she was exhausted from community planning, a phrase she used so often it became a kind of verbal wallpaper. I asked how the planning went, lightly, and she said it was fine, just boring logistics, and she acted like boredom-proved innocence. Then she added a detail about Grant, said he was under so much stress managing the building, said he was trying his best, said people did not appreciate him, and she said it with a tenderness that did not belong to a neighborly relationship. I kept my face neutral, nodded, and said, "Leadership is hard," and I watched her eyes search my expression for suspicion. When she did not find it, she relaxed, and that relaxation told me she was still measuring me, still treating me like a threat she had to monitor. I asked her if she had heard anything about the upcoming conduct hearing because I had seen the flyer again, and her fork paused mid-air for half a beat. Then she forced a laugh and told me to stop being so interested in boring HOA politics. I said it was our home, so the politics mattered, and she rolled her eyes, but the roll was too sharp to be playful. After dinner, she went to shower, and I sat at the table with my evidence folder open like a dull work task, because dullness is protective. I stapled the 2 merchant screenshots to blank paper, wrote the date and time under each, and signed the back of the page because signed pages are harder to dismiss as emotional scribbles. Then I slid the page into a clear sleeve and labeled it with a strip of tape, because order is a form of power when someone wants you to look chaotic. The next morning, the first real escalation arrived in the shape of a calendar invite, and it was not one Elena could deny. My work email chimed with an HR meeting request, marked urgent, and the subject line referenced concerns about workplace conduct. It did not name me directly in the subject, but I recognized the language, the same thinly sharp phrasing from the HOA notice, the same attempt to sound neutral while implying guilt. I sat at my desk and stared at the invite for a long minute, because the move was clean, and it was calculated, and it was exactly what I expected once I realized Elena was not operating alone. A private lie is dangerous, but a public allegation is a weapon, and someone had decided it was time to swing it. I took a screenshot of the invite, saved it, printed it, and filed it in the folder, because I had already learned that electronic things can disappear and paper stays heavy. When I told Elena about the HR invite that evening, I did not tell her as an accusation, and I did not tell her as a plea. I told her like a man discussing a parking ticket. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then she recovered too quickly. Then she asked what it was about with a voice that sounded concerned but felt rehearsed. I told her I did not know, but the invite suggested someone had raised conduct concerns. She frowned, shook her head, and said that was ridiculous, and she reached for my hand again like affection could remove paperwork from existence. Then she asked, carefully, whether I had said anything to anyone in the building about our misunderstanding, and the question was the first true confession she had offered without realizing it, because only a guilty person worries about what you said when you did not say anything. I told her I had not discussed our private life with anyone, because I had not, and I watched her exhale like she had been holding air in her lungs all day. She said the building gossip was toxic, that Grant was always trying to stop rumors, that people loved drama, and she said it with a practiced indignation that made Grant sound like a saint and everyone else sound like a threat. I told her I would attend the HR meeting and keep it professional, and she nodded with a smile that did not reach her eyes. The meeting happened 2 days later, in a glass room that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, and it was the kind of room designed to make everyone feel exposed. The HR representative was a woman named Marin, calm and precise, the kind of professional who believes tone is evidence. Elena was there too, which was the first sign the meeting was not about my workplace conduct at all, because Elena did not belong in my workplace meetings unless she had requested to be there or someone had invited her as a witness to something. She sat with her hands folded, posture perfect, face composed in a way that suggested she had practiced in a mirror. Grant Dorsey was there as well, which made the air change, because a man like Grant does not appear in other people's meetings unless he believes he has authority everywhere. He wore a polite smile, carried a folder like a prop, and greeted Maren by name with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. That familiarity told me he had already been in contact with her before I arrived, and that meant this was not a spontaneous concern. It was an organized push. Maren began with procedural language, explaining that the company had received a complaint, that they were obligated to review it, that the meeting was for clarity, and she said it all in that smooth tone meant to sound fair while still implying you are already suspected. Elena spoke next, not with direct accusations, but with carefully framed concerns, telling Maren she felt stressed, telling Maren I had been fixated, telling Maren I had been monitoring details, telling Maren she was worried about my emotional state, and she delivered it like a responsible spouse seeking support. She never said I threatened her, because that would have demanded evidence, but she kept circling that implication like a shark circling a dock. Grant chimed in as if he was a neutral community leader, saying he had observed tension in the building, saying residents had expressed concern, saying he hoped things could stay calm for everyone's safety, and he used the word safety the way controlling men use it, as a shield for control. I listened without interrupting, kept my face calm, kept my hands still, because the only thing they wanted more than my guilt was my reaction. Then, when Maren asked for my response, I did not argue feelings, and I did not insult Elena, and I did not call Grant out as a predator in a suit. I responded with structure. I told Maren that I had returned early from a trip, that my wife had told me she was in our bed, that I had sent a selfie from our bed showing it was empty, and that she had arrived home 20 minutes later panicking and changing the story. I kept my tone flat, because flat tone makes facts feel heavier. I said I did not raise my voice. I said I did not accuse her publicly. I said I did not contact the board. I said I had maintained routine, and I said I was attending this meeting because I respect procedures. Then I placed one sheet of paper on the table, a printed screenshot of the HR meeting invite itself, and I pointed out that the language of the invite mirrored language used in our building's HOA notices, which suggested someone was coordinating narratives across institutions. I did not say who. I did not make a dramatic claim. I simply said the similarity existed and could be reviewed. Maren's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with attention, because professionals notice patterns even when they pretend they do not. Elena shifted in her seat, her composure cracking by a fraction, and Grant's smile tightened like a belt pulled one notch too far. Maren asked if I had documentation of any specific incidents. I told her I had a personal timeline of events, dated and signed, and I offered to provide it if needed. I did not wave it around. I did not threaten with it. I offered it the way a careful person offers a seat to someone older. Elena tried to cut in, saying my documentation was part of the problem, that I was obsessive, that this was not healthy, and she looked at Maren like she expected immediate agreement. Instead, Maren asked Elena a question about the exact time of Elena's text claiming she was in bed, and Elena answered too quickly, then corrected herself, then smiled as if the correction was cute. I saw it, and I saw Maren see it too, because women like Maren have heard too many versions of the same story to miss the microfractures. Grant leaned forward, trying to regain control, and he said that whatever happened in the marriage was private, but the board's concern was community harmony. Maren responded that this was a workplace review, not an HOA hearing, and she asked Grant why he was present in a workplace meeting at all. Grant's face did not change much, but the muscles in his jaw tightened, and he said he was here as a supportive witness for Elena, because Elena felt unsafe. Maren asked whether any police reports existed, and Elena said no, and the word no landed like a dull thud, because it stripped the safety claim down to pure narrative. Maren ended the meeting by saying she would review the information and follow up in writing, and she asked that any future concerns be submitted with clear details and dates. That last phrase mattered, because clear details and dates are the natural enemy of vague allegations. As we stood to leave, Grant's posture shifted, and he moved toward me slightly, not close enough to be physical, but close enough to be seen as intimidating if I reacted. Elena watched my face, waiting for me to flare up, waiting for me to give her the scene she could later describe with trembling voice. I did not flare up. I nodded politely, thanked Maren for her time, and I walked out first, because leaving first is also a kind of control. In the parking lot, Elena caught up with me and asked why I had to embarrass her, and she said embarrass like she had been wronged. I told her I did not embarrass her. I simply answered questions with facts. She said facts were not the point, that relationships were about feelings, that I was making her look bad, and she said look bad like her image was more important than our marriage. I told her that if she wanted people to believe she was safe, she should stop creating situations where her timelines collapse under basic questions. She stared at me, and for a brief moment the mask dropped, and I saw anger, not sadness, not fear, but anger at losing control. Then she smiled again, soft and sweet, and she told me we should take that weekend trip after all, because we needed to reconnect. That was the moment I understood the trip was no longer a suggestion. It was an extraction plan. She wanted me away from witnesses, away from paper trails, away from the building's procedural arena, and she wanted me somewhere she could cry without anyone watching and call it resolution. That night I sat at the kitchen table, opened my folder, and added the HR meeting invite screenshot, then added a written summary of what was said, not with emotional adjectives, but with times and sequence. I wrote down Maren's request for dates. I wrote down Grant's repeated use of the word safety without any report. I wrote down Elena's correction on the time. I signed it, sleeved it, and I felt something settle in my chest. The attack had begun, which meant I had waited long enough. Now it was time to choose where to end it. The day after the HR meeting, Elena tried a new strategy, and it was quieter than accusations but sharper than tears. She started acting affectionate in front of everyone and distant in private, like she was preparing the building to believe that any coldness from her was a response to my behavior, not the cause of it. In the lobby, she would lean into me, laugh loudly at my small comments, touch my arm while Nolan watched, and she would call me sweet nicknames she had not used in months, the kind of performance that makes observers feel like they are witnessing love rather than rehearsal. In the elevator, she would stand close, smile at the mirror, and then, once we were alone in the apartment, she would move away as if my presence irritated her skin. The contrast was not just emotional, it was strategic, and it made my decision easier, because nothing clarifies a situation like watching someone weaponize intimacy as a public shield. I kept my routine, because routine is visible, and visibility undercuts smear campaigns. I went down to the mailroom at the same time every morning, nodded at the same people, carried my coffee like a prop from a stable life, and I watched how the building watched me. Nolan's friendliness had become sharper, less curious, and more evaluative. The doorman's greetings had shifted into a formal politeness that felt like distance. Even the front desk clerk, who normally treated everyone the same, had started speaking to Elena with a warmth he did not offer me, like he had been briefed on who needed support. I did not confront any of it, because confronting gossip makes it feel true. Instead, I documented the facts that mattered and let the social noise swirl around them like wind around a stone. On day 16, I returned to the HOA office, not to complain and not to plead, but to request procedure. Lila Kent was at her desk again, reading an email with the expression of someone who has seen too many adults behave like children. I greeted her, gave my unit number, and told her I wanted to request that any hearing involving my household include live minutes projection and explicit notation when evidence is received. I kept my voice calm and my request specific because specificity forces bureaucracies to either comply or deny, and both outcomes create a record. Lila asked what evidence I intended to submit, and I told her I had a simple ledger of time-based contradictions built from my own account notifications, shared calendar exports, and publicly visible notices. I emphasized publicly visible and my own account because I wanted her to understand I was not bringing anything illegal into her office. Lila nodded slowly and said that was acceptable, but she warned me that hearings could become chaotic if emotions took over. I told her I had no interest in chaos, and I meant it. Then she said something that sounded casual but landed like a weight. She said that the board had received multiple complaints recently, and she wanted to be clear that any misuse of the complaint process would be handled seriously. Misuse was her word, and the word was a blade because it meant she already suspected someone was gaming the system. I asked her gently whether she believed the complaint process was being used as leverage by any board member. Lila did not answer directly. She simply said that minutes exist for a reason and that she keeps them clean. When I got back upstairs, Elena was waiting in the kitchen like she had been listening for my keys. She asked where I had been with a smile that looked friendly to an outsider and looked sharp to me. I told her I checked on some hearing procedures because I wanted clarity about the complaint process. Elena's smile faltered, then returned, and she told me I was overreacting, that the board was just doing its job, that Grant was under so much pressure, and she said Grant's name with a softness that made my stomach turn. I asked her, lightly, why she cared so much about Grant's stress. Elena laughed, said everyone cared because he was a community leader, and she told me I was paranoid again, that I was turning everything into a conspiracy. I nodded, told her I hoped she was right, and I walked away, because walking away is the clearest sign that you will not be manipulated into a scene. That evening, another piece fell into my lap without me reaching for it, and it came through the one channel Elena could not fully control, my own device. A memory notification popped up from our shared cloud album, the kind that shows you a photo from a past day, and it displayed a thumbnail of Elena in a lobby bar setting, noticed only in the background of a group shot. I did not open the photo to zoom faces or hunt drama, but I did open the metadata screen that our shared account already allowed, because metadata is not voyeurism. It is a timestamp the platform willingly displays. The date was within the window of my trip. The location tag showed the boutique hotel area. The file upload time was late night. My chest tightened because that was not an assumption anymore. That was a time and a place connected to her and our shared digital footprint. I took a screenshot of the metadata screen, printed it, signed the back, and slid it into a sleeve because I was no longer collecting hints. I was collecting anchors. Elena noticed the printer later, asked what I was printing, and I told her it was work paperwork. She watched me too closely while I spoke, then forced a laugh and said I was so boring, and boredom was her way of dismissing anything that threatened her. Later, when we went down to the lobby together, she held my arm and smiled widely as Nolan greeted us, and Nolan's eyes moved over me like he was checking whether I looked angry. Grant was nearby again, talking to a resident about parking rules with the smug ease of a man who enjoys being obeyed. Elena's attention tilted toward him like a magnet. Grant noticed her, smiled, and then looked at me with that same polished knife expression. He asked, loudly enough for the lobby to hear, whether everything at home was settled because the building valued calm residents. The question was framed as concern, but it was bait. If I reacted, he could call it volatility. If I stayed calm, he could call it passive-aggressive. Either way, he wanted a story. I gave him none. I nodded politely, said we were doing fine, and I thanked him for his dedication to procedure. My use of the word procedure made Lila, who had just stepped out of the office, glance up for half a second, and her glance told me she was tracking the same pattern I was. Grant's smile tightened, because men like him do not like hearing their own tools used against them. The pressure in our apartment became heavier after that lobby moment. Elena stopped pretending the weekend trip was optional. She started mentioning it like a scheduled fact, talking about packing lists, suggesting we leave Friday after work, saying she already checked availability, saying we needed to get out of this toxic building energy. I told her I was not sure about the timing. She frowned, then smiled, then frowned again, cycling masks like a person scrolling through options. She asked why I was resisting, and she accused me of wanting to punish her, and the accusation was careful enough to sound like pain rather than aggression. I told her I was not punishing anyone. I was simply not making travel plans while there were unresolved procedural issues in our home environment. The phrase procedural issues made her eyes flash with anger because she heard the hidden meaning, and she could not argue with it without admitting she understood it. She tried a softer tactic. She cried in the bedroom, quiet tears meant to make me feel cruel. I sat beside her, offered her a tissue, told her I cared, and I did not apologize for being calm, because apologizing for calm is how you hand your spine to someone else. On day 18, Ray invited herself over again, and she arrived with that bright, performative confidence that always made me feel like she belonged on a small stage with cheap lighting. She asked Elena how she was holding up, asked if she felt safe, asked if she had support, and she said those words loudly, as if the hallway needed to hear them. Elena played along, sighing dramatically, saying she was tired, saying she felt misunderstood, saying she wished things could go back to normal. Ray looked at me with a sympathetic expression that was too polished to be genuine, and she told me she hoped I was taking care of my mental health, because stress can make people spiral. Spiral was the word, and it was not an accident. I nodded, told her I appreciated concern, and I said I was focusing on facts and routines, because facts and routines keep everyone safe. Ray's smile faltered, because she wanted me to talk about feelings, where she could twist the narrative. Elena watched Ray's face, then watched mine, and I saw a silent exchange of strategy between them. That was when I understood Ray was not just a friend, she was a coach. Elena's repeated phrases, her timing corrections, her consistent framing of me as fixated, all of it suddenly looked less like panic and more like training. That night, after Ray left, Elena asked me why I hated her friends, and the question was a trap meant to make me defend myself emotionally. I told her I did not hate anyone, but I did not trust people who use vague claims to shape institutional responses. She asked what I meant, and I told her the HR meeting invite and the HOA conduct notice shared the same thin language, which suggested coordination. Elena laughed, called it a conspiracy again, and then, in the same breath, she told me Grant had offered to help mediate because he was good at resolving conflicts. That was the moment the mid-story twist stopped being a suspicion and became a clean line. The lover was not just a lover, he was an institutional lever, and Elena was using him, or he was using her, or both. I asked Elena, calmly, whether Grant had ever been in our unit while I was away. She stared at me, and for a long moment she said nothing, because silence is hard to edit. Then she said no, of course not, and she said it with too much emphasis, and she immediately followed it with a complaint about me being paranoid, and the speed of that pivot told me she had hit something sharp inside herself. I did not press further, because pressing would have created a private fight, and private fights are useless when your opponent is already building a public story. Instead, I went to the kitchen table, opened my folder, and began assembling what I would submit at the hearing. I kept it simple, a one-page timeline of the bed lie and the 20-minute gap, the package pickup timestamp, the shared calendar export, the merchant notifications from my own account, the cloud album metadata screen, the HR invite screenshot. Each piece had a date label, each page was signed on the back, each sleeve was clear, clean, and boring. I was not building a dramatic reveal, I was building a procedural trap. If Grant and Elena wanted to weaponize institutions, then institutions were where they would lose, because institutions, when forced to follow their own rules, hate manipulation more than they hate uncomfortable truth. The next morning, I received a short email from Marin in HR, confirming that the meeting summary would be filed and that any future concerns should include exact dates and specific behaviors. And the message read like a quiet warning to the person who had tried to use vague fear as a weapon. I printed the email header and filed it too, not because it proved adultery, but because it proved a pattern of attempted narrative control. Elena did not know about the email yet, and I did not tell her, because telling her would only allow her to adapt. Adaptation is what liars do best. My job, in this unwanted new role, was to stop giving her time to adapt. That evening, I texted Lila Kent and requested the hearing be placed on the calendar formally for the earliest available date, and I requested that the minutes be projected live during the session. Lila responded with a brief confirmation, formal and clean, and she added one line that made my pulse slow into something colder. She wrote that evidence submissions would be noted as received in the minutes in real time. I read that line twice, then put my phone down and looked at Elena across the room. Elena was on the couch, laughing at something on her screen, relaxed in a way that told me she believed she still controlled the frame. She did not know that the frame was about to become official minutes. She did not know that her story was about to meet paper that did not care how pretty her tears looked. When Elena later asked again about the weekend trip, I told her calmly that I could not commit to leaving town until after the HOA hearing. Her smile dropped, and for a second, her face showed pure calculation. Not hurt, not love, just calculation. Then she recovered, and she told me I was choosing a building meeting over my marriage, and she said it like a condemnation. I told her I was choosing clarity, because clarity is the only thing that can save a marriage from rot. She stared at me, then turned away, and I watched her thumbs move quickly on her phone, sending messages she thought would protect her. I let her send them. I let her believe she had time. And then, in the quiet after her screen went dark, I opened my folder one more time, checked each sleeve, checked each label, and understood with a kind of grim satisfaction that the next time she tried to rewrite reality, she would have to do it in a room where someone typed "evidence received" in front of witnesses. The hearing date landed on the calendar like a nail hammered into wood, clean, official, and suddenly heavier than all the private conversations Elena had tried to drown in kisses and tears. Lila's confirmation was brief, procedural, and almost indifferent, which made it perfect, because indifference is what you want from a record keeper when you need truth to outlive charm. Elena did not know the exact date yet, at least not from me, but in our building nothing stays secret for long, and the moment paperwork enters the bloodstream of a community, the gossip organs start pumping. 2 days after I requested the hearing, Nolan ran into me in the lobby with the same staged surprise he always wore when he was delivering someone else's message. He smiled too widely, asked if I was doing okay, then said he heard the board might be reviewing some tensions soon, and the way he said tensions sounded like he was tasting the word. I nodded, kept my voice flat, and told him I welcomed reviews when they were based on documented facts. His smile twitched, and he asked whether I had been collecting documents, like he was fishing for something he could report back upstairs to the real power. I told him I believed in clarity, and I reminded him that public notices exist so residents can prepare, which was a polite way of telling him I was not hiding and I was not afraid. Elena shifted into a new kind of urgency after that, the kind that tries to look like affection but moves like an evacuation plan. She packed a small overnight bag and left it by the closet, then pretended it was just an organized habit. She texted me links to hotels, pushed me to confirm Friday, and framed the trip as a gift she was offering to save our marriage. She kept saying save, which was rich, because you do not save a house by lighting matches under the curtains. I did not refuse outright, because outright refusals become evidence in the wrong hands, but I did not agree either. I told her I could not leave town while procedural matters were pending, and I watched the word procedural land in her throat like a stone. She tried to laugh it off, then tried to shame me with a soft voice, then tried irritation, then tried tears, cycling so fast it looked almost like a performance for an invisible audience. In the middle of her tears, she said something that slipped out too sharp to be accidental, something about how Grant can make this easy if I would stop pushing. The moment her mouth formed Grant's name in that context, her face changed, and she knew she had shown too much. She tried to correct it immediately, claiming she meant the board in general, claiming she meant mediation, claiming she meant community support. I nodded, let her talk, and let her bury herself. Because the best part about a person correcting themselves is that they confirm what they are trying to hide. That night, I slept lightly and woke before dawn, with the kind of clarity that feels like a bruise. I did not want to search for more proof, because searching is a hunger that turns decent men into something uglier. But I needed one anchor that connected Elena's timing lie to a physical reality she could not rewrite. I had avoided thinking about our doorbell camera for weeks because it felt too close to surveillance, even though it faced our own doorway and existed for basic security. I told myself I did not want to become the kind of man who scrolls through footage like it is entertainment. Still, the camera was ours, the footage belonged to our household, and if someone had been at our door while I was away, it was not snooping to know it. It was sanity. I opened the app on my phone with slow fingers and no adrenaline, because adrenaline makes you sloppy, and sloppy becomes the story about you. I searched by date, the day of my trip, the night Elena claimed she was in our bed, and I did not watch long clips, because long clips invite imagination. I looked for motion thumbnails and timestamps only, the way you look at an index before opening a book. There were a few delivery triggers, a neighbor walking past, and then one clip that made my stomach tighten so hard I had to breathe through my nose. The timestamp was late, well after Elena's usual bedtime, and the thumbnail showed two figures at our door, close together, one with a tall, squared outline, one with smaller shoulders. The taller figure stood in a posture I recognized from the lobby, that slightly arrogant forward tilt Grant used when he wanted to look in charge. The image was not perfectly clear, but it did not need to be perfect, because the time and the context did most of the work. I opened the clip, watched it once, and forced myself to keep it factual. Elena opened the door quickly, pulled the taller figure inside, and the door shut with a speed that did not look like a casual neighbor visit. No faces were close enough to identify cleanly, but there were details a liar hates: the time, the movement, the urgency, the fact that our doorway had been used as a private entrance while I was out of town. I paused the clip on the moment the taller figure stepped over the threshold, then took a still-frame screenshot that captured the timestamp clearly. I did not zoom. I did not enhance. I did not edit. Editing invites argument, and argument invites doubt. I saved the image, printed it, and watched the printer feed the paper out like a slow confession. I wrote the date on the margin, wrote "doorway still frame, household camera" beneath it, and signed the back of the page. Then I placed it in a clear sleeve and labeled it with tape like it was a boring administrative attachment, because boring is how you make something undeniable. I slid the sleeve into my folder, closed it, and felt a strange calm settle over me, because now I was no longer relying on social inference. Now I had a physical timeline that led straight to our door. Elena woke later and walked into the kitchen with a smile that was soft at first, then tight when she noticed the folder was on the table. She asked what I was working on in that cheerful voice she used when she needed to sound harmless. I told her I was preparing for the hearing because the board expected organized submissions, and I said it like it was a simple community task. Her smile cracked, just for a second, and she asked what hearing, as if she had never heard the word before in her life. I told her the conduct hearing date had been confirmed, and I told her Lila would be projecting the minutes live. Elena blinked rapidly, and her breathing changed, because projected minutes meant there would be no safe place for her to improvise. She tried to pivot into indignation, asking why I was dragging the board into our marriage, asking why I was humiliating her, asking why I was obsessed. I stayed quiet until her words slowed. Then I said that I was not dragging anyone into anything. I was responding to the fact that institutions had already been dragged into our marriage without my consent. Her eyes flashed with anger. Then she softened quickly, moved closer, touched my arm, and asked if we could talk privately like adults. I agreed to talk, but I refused to argue, and that distinction mattered, because arguments are what she wanted, and talking is what I wanted. Talking creates phrasing. Phrasing becomes record. We sat on the couch, and Elena started with feelings again, calling herself overwhelmed, calling the building toxic, calling me distant, calling everything a misunderstanding. I listened, nodded, and then asked her one question, a calm one that did not accuse. I asked where she was when she texted that she was in our bed. Elena answered quickly, then stopped, then corrected herself, and I watched the correction happen like a crack spreading across ice. She said she was on her way home, then she said she meant she was getting into bed, then she said she had been in the lobby talking to Grant about a resident issue, and she said it like it was normal and appropriate. The mention of Grant came again, uninvited, and she did not even notice. That was the problem with coached language. You start repeating the same names until they sound like part of the air. I asked why she panicked and burst in 20 minutes later, and Elena said she was rushing because she thought I was angry, and she needed to fix it. I told her I had not been angry. I had been confused, and that her panic did not match the situation unless there was something else she was afraid of. Elena's face tightened, and she said I was twisting things. I nodded, and I said I did not need to twist anything, because her timeline already twisted on its own. 2 days later, the building delivered its next pressure move, and it arrived in an envelope slid under our door, crisp and official, like a threat dressed as stationery. The letter was a notice of an HOA violation, citing unauthorized visitors and community disruption, and it stated that further violations could lead to fines and access restrictions. Elena held the letter in both hands as she read, and she performed shock like she was in a play. She insisted she had no idea how this happened, insisted people were targeting her, insisted Grant would fix it, and she said Grant would fix it like he was a personal attorney, not a board chair. I took the letter from her gently, read it, and noticed the date range referenced the period when I was out of town. That was not an accident. It was a warning, and it was also an admission that someone had been tracking her visitors. If Grant was truly trying to protect Elena, he would not have allowed a violation letter to name her time window like that. This was not protection. It was leverage. I photographed the letter beside that day's newspaper, because a dated physical context prevents later claims of forgery. I filed the photo, then filed the letter itself in a sleeve, and I wrote one line in my ledger. HOA notice references trip window, implies documented entries. Elena watched me file it and called me cold, called me cruel, called me obsessed again, and each word sounded like an echo of Ray's coaching. I did not respond emotionally. I told her that if someone was targeting her, then proper documentation was the best defense, and I said it like advice, not like an attack. That made her angrier, because advice implies you are not drowning, and she needed me to look like I was drowning. That evening, Elena tried to make the weekend trip happen by force. She told me she booked a hotel anyway, told me she used a refundable rate, told me it would be good for us, and she placed the booking confirmation on the table like a dare. I looked at it, nodded, and said we could talk about it after the hearing. Her face went pale, and the pale was not disappointment. It was calculation, like she had just realized her schedule had lost its safe corridor. She stood up abruptly, paced, then said, she could not live like this, meaning she could not live with a man who would not be manipulated. Then she grabbed her phone, walked into the hallway, and made another whisper call, and she did not even pretend to hide it this time. She wanted me to hear enough to feel threatened, because threatened men act. I stayed seated, stared at the booking confirmation, and I waited for her to finish. When she returned, she smiled like nothing happened, and she asked if I wanted tea. I said no, and I kept my voice steady. The steadiness seemed to irritate her more than any insult could. The night before the hearing, Elena stopped sleeping well. She tossed, checked her phone repeatedly, left the bed twice, and came back with the sharp smell of breath mints and anxiety. Around midnight, her phone buzzed, and she sat up so fast the mattress shifted. She glanced at the screen, then looked at me as if to see whether I was watching. I did not move. I did not ask. I did not give her a scene. She got out of bed, went into the living room, and I heard her whispering again. And this time, I heard one clear phrase through the thin apartment quiet, a phrase that felt like a door slamming. She said, "He has something." She did not say my name, but she did not need to. I lay there in the dark, listening to her fear, and I understood that she had finally realized I was not bluffing. The hearing was not a threat anymore. It was a countdown. The morning of the hearing, Elena behaved like a woman preparing to walk into court, even though it was only an HOA room with folding chairs and a projector. She dressed carefully, chose a neutral outfit, wore earrings that made her look composed, and applied makeup with the precision of someone painting armor onto her face. She told me she wanted us to arrive together, because optics mattered, and the word optics was the most honest thing she had said in weeks. I agreed to arrive together, because I wanted the room to see the truth of our proximity without the truth being distorted by who walked in alone. In the elevator, she held my arm as if we were a perfect couple, and she looked at our reflection in the mirrored wall with a faint smile that felt less like affection and more like rehearsal. I stared straight ahead and breathed slowly, because slow breathing makes your hands steady, and steady hands hold paper without shaking. The hearing room was the clubhouse space near the lobby, normally used for community announcements and bland holiday parties. Today it had been rearranged into a small tribunal with a long table at the front, a projector screen on the wall, and rows of chairs facing forward. Lila sat near the front with a laptop open, posture alert, eyes sharp, ready to type. Grant stood beside the table talking to Nolan and another board member, and he looked confident, almost relaxed, like a man who believed the room belonged to him. When he saw me enter, his smile sharpened, and he greeted Elena first, quietly, with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. Elena smiled back in a controlled way, and then she introduced me to the other board member as if I was a new acquaintance instead of her husband. That small social downgrade was not accidental. It was part of her frame. She wanted me to feel like an outsider in my own building, so I would react. I did not react. Residents filtered in, people who claimed they were curious about policy, but whose eyes were bright with the thrill of watching someone else's life wobble. I recognized the types immediately, the ones who love rules only because rules allow them to judge. I saw the doorman in the back, not seated, just watching, because staff always watch when the building is about to pick a side. Ray arrived too, which made my pulse slow, because friends do not attend HOA hearings unless they are there to shape perception. She sat beside Elena, leaned in close, and whispered something that made Elena's jaw tighten. Nolan hovered near Grant like a loyal pet. The air smelled faintly of coffee, cheap paper, and the heavy sweetness of perfume that tells you someone wanted to look unbothered. Under it all was the smell of electronics warming up, that faint plastic heat from the projector, and it made the room feel like a place where something official was about to be born. Grant called the meeting to order with the same voice he used in the lobby, authoritative, polished, and faintly smug. He spoke about community harmony, visitor policies, and resident well-being, and he said well-being like it was his private brand. He referenced complaints about tension and disruptive behavior, and he framed it all as neutral maintenance of standards. Then he invited Elena to speak first, which told me everything about whose hearing this really was. Elena stood, held her hands lightly together, and spoke with practiced calm. She said she felt stressed. She said she felt watched. She said she was worried about my mental state. She said she had been trying to keep things private, but that my behavior had forced her to seek community support. She never said I harmed her, because she could not, but she painted a picture of me as cold, controlling, and fixated, the same adjectives Ray had been feeding her like candy. The room listened. Some people nodded. Some people looked uncomfortable. The uncomfortable ones were the ones who disliked drama, but could not stop consuming it anyway. Grant then asked me to respond, and he asked it with that slight tilt of his head, the tilt that says, he expects you to fail. I stood slowly, because rushing looks guilty, and I thanked the board for the opportunity to clarify, because courtesy makes it harder to frame you as dangerous. I said I would keep my response factual, time-based, and limited to documented items I lawfully possessed. I watched Grant's smile tighten at the word lawfully. Then I began with the only canon that mattered, the moment that started everything. I said I returned early from a trip. I said Elena was not home. I said I texted her and asked where she was. I said she replied that she was in our bed. I said I sent a selfie from our bed showing it was empty. I said 20 minutes later she burst in panicking and changed her story. I kept my voice level and my sentences clean, and I watched residents' faces shift, because time and sequence are hard to argue with when delivered without rage. Grant interrupted quickly, asking why that mattered to community policy, and I told him it mattered because that incident triggered a cascade of institutional involvement that I did not initiate, including an HR meeting request tied to vague allegations that mirrored HOA complaint phrasing. Lila's fingers paused above her keyboard for a fraction of a second, because that kind of coordination is exactly what minutes are supposed to protect against. Grant tried to redirect again, but I stayed calm and asked Lila, politely, to note in the minutes that I was submitting a time-based evidence packet related to complaint misuse and unauthorized visitors. Lila nodded once, and I saw her type, and the projector screen lit with the words as they formed. Black text on white background, simple and deadly. Evidence packet received. The room went quiet for a beat because public records have a gravity that gossip does not. I walked to the front table and placed my clear sleeves down in a neat stack, not dramatic, not theatrical, just organized. I did not dump papers. I did not wave anything. I placed them like a man submitting a form at a bank. Lila leaned forward, glanced at the labels, and typed again, and the projector displayed another short line noting the categories. Doorway still frame, household camera, shared calendar export, week view, merchant alerts, husband-owned account, cloud album metadata screen, shared account, HOA notice letter, dated. The words looked boring on the screen, and boring was exactly what made them dangerous, because boring is what survives when people try to claim you are emotionally spiraling. Elena sat very still as Lila typed, her face composed but her eyes bright with panic she could not hide. Ray leaned toward her, whispering fast, probably coaching her next move, and Elena nodded slightly, like a student receiving instructions. Grant cleared his throat and asked me to explain the doorway still frame. I did not describe it like a jealous husband. I described it like a resident explaining a time-stamped security record. I said the camera faced our own doorway. I said the clip was from the night during my trip. I said the still frame showed Elena opening the door late at night and pulling a tall figure inside. I said the timestamp was visible. I said I was not asking the board to identify faces. I was asking the board to acknowledge that the HOA violation letter referenced that same time window, which suggested someone had been monitoring unauthorized visitors and then using the complaint process selectively. I watched Grant's expression shift from smug to controlled irritation, because the argument had moved away from morality and into process, and process is where bullies lose their advantage. Grant tried to frame my documentation as obsession again, saying it was unhealthy to collect details, and he said it while looking at residents like he expected them to nod. I responded calmly that I collected details only after institutions were brought into my marriage without my consent, and that the healthiest response to vague allegations is documented reality. I asked the board a direct procedural question, still calm, still polite. If the HOA claimed there were unauthorized visitors, could the board provide the specific entry logs or complaint dates that justified the violation letter? The room shifted again, because I had moved from defending myself to requesting the board's own documentation. Grant's eyes narrowed. He said entry logs were sensitive. I nodded and said I understood, and I asked whether Lila could simply confirm, for the minutes, that the violation letter was based on specific documented entries rather than rumor. Lila looked at Grant, then looked at her laptop, and said she could only type what was stated on record. Grant hesitated, just for a second, and that hesitation was loud. Then he said, on record, that the board had received repeated complaints supported by staff observations. Staff observations. The phrase made the doorman in the back straighten slightly, as if he had just been pulled into something he did not volunteer for. I turned my head gently and looked toward the back of the room, not accusing, not challenging, just looking, and I asked whether any staff member present wished to clarify what they observed. The doorman did not speak immediately. He glanced toward Grant, then toward Lila, then toward the residents, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the calculation of a working person deciding whether to lie for a board chair or tell the truth for his own safety. Finally, he cleared his throat and said carefully that he had seen Elena return late on certain nights, but he could not confirm who she was with, because he was not stationed on our floor. His statement was neutral, and neutrality was still a crack in Grant's attempt to make staff into weapons. Grant's jaw tightened. Ray looked angry, because a neutral staff statement does not help a smear. Elena's face flushed slightly, because the room had just heard that her late-night movements were not just my imagination. Lila typed the doorman's statement into the minutes, and seeing it appear on the screen made it real, in a way whispers never are. Grant attempted to regain control by shifting the discussion to resident safety again, implying that my calm documentation was part of a pattern of intimidation. I kept my voice steady and asked him why safety claims had been used in a workplace HR meeting that Elena requested, a meeting where no police report existed and where the HR representative asked for dates and specifics. Grant tried to interrupt, but Lila's typing kept pace, and the words on the screen made his interruptions look like fear. I then referenced the HR email follow-up, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a procedural note, saying that the company requested exact dates and specific behaviors for any future concerns. I offered to provide a printed header, if the board wanted it for context, and I watched Grant's face tighten further, because now the room had heard that another institution had refused vague narratives. Elena shifted in her seat, and she whispered to Ray, and Ray's whisper looked like anger, not comfort. Grant called for a brief recess, claiming the board needed to review the evidence categories, and he said it with the voice of a man trying to stop a leak before it floods the room. Lila announced the recess and kept her laptop open, because minutes do not pause for ego. Residents stood and murmured, and the murmur sounded like electricity. Elena pulled Ray aside near the hallway and spoke fast, hands moving, the kind of frantic planning that looks like love from far away and looks like crisis up close. Nolan hovered near them too, eyes darting. Then he walked quickly toward Grant and whispered in his ear. Grant's posture tightened. He nodded once, sharply, and then he walked toward me with a controlled smile that did not touch his eyes. He stopped a few feet away and spoke low, so only I could hear, which was rich, coming from a man who claimed everything was about community transparency. He said we could end this quietly. He said the board could drop the violation letter. He said Elena was under stress. He said I was making the building uncomfortable. He offered to mediate, like a king offering mercy. I looked at him calmly and asked whether his mediation would include explaining, on record, why his figure appeared at my doorway late during my trip. His smile froze, and his eyes flashed with something like anger. He said I was making assumptions, and I nodded and said I was not assuming anything. I was documenting timestamps. Grant's jaw tightened again, and he stepped back like he was stepping away from a hazard. When the recess ended, Lila called the room back to order, and Grant's composure was slightly different, less smug, more sharp, like he had realized the hearing was slipping. He announced that the board would review the evidence packet and determine whether complaint misuse had occurred, and he tried to sound neutral, but neutrality does not come easily to men who crave control. He then asked Elena if she wished to respond to the doorway still frame. Elena stood slowly, and I saw her hands tremble just a little, not because she was afraid for her marriage, but because she was afraid for her narrative. She said the figure could have been anyone. She said neighbors visit. She said she did not remember. She said my camera made her uncomfortable. She said I was invading her privacy. I let her speak, then I asked one calm question, the kind that forces a choice between truth and absurdity. I asked whether she was claiming she opened our door late at night to a neighbor during my trip, and whether she wanted that claim written into the official minutes. Elena stared at me, and for a moment she said nothing, because minutes are a trap for improvisers. Ray whispered urgently behind her, and Elena swallowed, then said she did not want to argue semantics. Semantics. The word was the last refuge of someone who just realized details matter. Grant tried to end the hearing quickly after that, claiming the board had enough to review, but Lila asked calmly whether the board wished to note any immediate actions in the minutes, because that is what procedure requires. Grant hesitated again, then said the board would suspend any immediate access restrictions until review was complete, and he said it like he was granting a favor, even though it was the only fair move left. Leela typed it. The projector displayed it. Residents saw it. Elena's face tightened because she had wanted the board to punish me quickly, and quick punishment had just been denied. As people stood and filed out, the room buzzed with whispers that sounded different than before. These were not playful whispers now. These were whispers shaped by the weight of projected minutes and evidence categories. Elena walked quickly toward the door with Ray beside her, and she did not look at me. Grant stayed behind, speaking low to Nolan and the other board member, posture rigid, and I noticed Lila carefully closing her laptop as if she was sealing a container. She looked up at me briefly, expression unreadable, and then she nodded once, a small gesture that felt like acknowledgement of something she could not say out loud. Back in the hallway, Elena finally turned on me, her composure breaking in the narrow space where cameras were fewer and witnesses were scattered. She hissed that I was ruining her life, that I was humiliating her, that I was sick, and her words came out like a script she had rehearsed for a future audience. I did not respond to the insults. I told her calmly that she had a chance to stop this weeks ago by telling the truth about that first text. She stared at me with pure hatred for a moment, then softened instantly when Nolan walked past because she needed witnesses to see her as wounded, not furious. The mask swap happened so fast it almost made me laugh, except nothing about this was funny anymore. We rode the elevator up in silence, and Elena's phone buzzed twice in her hand, and she kept her thumb over the screen like she was hiding a wound. When we entered the apartment, she walked straight to the bedroom, shut the door, and I heard her crying. But the crying sounded wrong, sharp and controlled, like someone rehearsing emotion for later. I stood in the kitchen, placed my folder on the table, and stared at the clear sleeves. The hearing had not ended the war. It had simply forced the war into the open, where minutes could capture it and witnesses could remember it. I knew Elena would not surrender now. A woman who panics at an empty bed does not suddenly become honest under a projector. An hour later, a notification hit my phone from my own account, and it was not a small coffee charge this time. It was a hotel deposit hold, dated for Friday. The weekend Elena claimed was refundable and harmless. The amount was larger, the merchant name was clear, and the timestamp showed it was processed while she was in the hearing room pretending she wanted peace. I stared at the notification until my pulse slowed into something cold. Then I took a screenshot, because that is what I do now. I did not knock on the bedroom door. I did not demand explanations. I simply printed the screenshot, signed the back, and placed it into a new sleeve. Because the late twist was beginning to form, and I could feel it in the air like metal before a storm. And whatever Elena had planned for Friday was not a couple's trip anymore. It was a coordinated exit with someone else already booked into the story. Friday arrived with the kind of quiet that feels staged, like the world is holding its breath so you can hear your own thoughts. Elena moved around the apartment too calmly, humming softly while she packed, as if the hearing had been a little storm that already passed, as if the hotel deposit hold on my phone never existed. She told me she booked the weekend because she loved me, because she wanted us to heal, because she did not want strangers deciding our marriage. She kept saying strangers while her phone buzzed, and she kept flipping it face down like it was a living thing. I nodded, stayed polite, and asked one practical question about the booking, the kind of question a normal husband would ask. She said it was refundable, said it was under her name, said she handled it, and she smiled like she had just fixed everything with initiative. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I simply asked for the confirmation number because hotels ask for it at check-in. Elena froze for half a breath, then laughed and said she would text it later, and her laugh was too quick, too bright, too trained. When she left the room, I opened my folder and added one more page to the stack, the hotel deposit alert printed and signed. Then, I did the only follow-up that stayed inside my rules. I called the hotel's front desk as the payer on the hold and asked for a one-line confirmation of the reservation status. Names not required, just whether the booking was for one guest or two. The clerk kept it professional and said the reservation showed 2 guests, and she repeated only the payer's name, mine, because the hold was on my account. I thanked her, wrote down the time of the call, and saved the call log timestamp screenshot on my phone. I printed that too, signed it, and slid it into a sleeve with the rest, because now I had a clean chain. My account, their confirmation, 2 guests, Friday. Elena returned and announced we should leave by 6, and she said it like a schedule she had already promised to someone else. I told her I could not leave town today because there was still an open review in the building, and I wanted the minutes finalized before we traveled. Her face tightened, and she tried to keep it soft by calling me stubborn, but the softness failed and anger leaked through. She accused me of trying to control her. She accused me of punishing her. She accused me of wanting a public victory more than a private marriage. I listened, then asked her calmly why a couple's reset reservation would be set for 2 guests while the payer line showed my name. Her eyes widened so fast it looked like fear before it turned into rage. She said I was spying. She said I was making things up. She said I was sick. Then she pivoted hard, grabbed her bag, and said she was going alone to clear her head. The words were designed to make me chase her, because chasing creates a scene, and scenes become stories. I did not chase. I watched her storm out, then I went straight downstairs to Lila Kent's office and asked for an emergency agenda addendum, complaint misuse and conflict of interest review, because a board chair should not be entangled in the resident he is protecting. Lila looked at me for a long moment, then asked whether I had new time-based documentation that changed the risk profile. I placed one sleeve on her desk, not the whole folder, just the hotel confirmation chain, and the doorway still frame with timestamp. Lila read the labels, eyes steady, and she said she could call an emergency session that evening with minutes projected live because residents had a right to transparent process. She did not smile. She did not sympathize. She simply moved the machine of procedure forward. By the time I returned upstairs, Elena's side of the closet looked lighter, and my phone buzzed with a message from Nolan asking whether everything was okay and whether I was coming to the clubhouse tonight. The question was too perfect, too informed, and it confirmed the late twist without anyone saying it aloud. Elena was not trying to escape the marriage quietly. She was trying to escape the record, and she had already lined up witnesses to call it my fault. I typed one short reply to Nolan and kept it boring. I said I would attend the session, and I would bring documents, and I would keep it calm. As the sun dropped, the building's hallways filled with foot traffic and whisper energy, and I realized this was not a marriage argument anymore. This was a battle over who got to write reality in a room full of people who loved simple stories. Elena wanted a clean exit with a messy husband narrative behind her. Grant wanted control of the minutes. Ray wanted the version where she was the loyal friend who protected a fragile woman. And I wanted one thing only: a public record that could not be edited later. The clubhouse room was fuller than the first hearing because emergency sessions attract the same people who slow down for car accidents. Lila sat at the front again with her laptop open and the projector warming the wall with white light. Two board members sat beside her, stiff and quiet, and Grant stood near the table with his jaw tight and his smile forced, like a man who realized the room might not obey him tonight. Elena arrived 5 minutes late, dressed too carefully again, eyes bright with that controlled panic, and Ray sat beside her as if she was legal counsel, whispering and nodding like a coach between rounds. Nolan paced near the door, checking phones, feeding updates to someone with the urgency of a courier. Lila called the session to order and stated, on record, that the agenda included complaint misuse and conflict of interest concerns tied to documented resident submissions. She began typing immediately, and the first line appeared on the projector. Minutes projected live. That line alone changed the air, because now every breath had a receipt. Grant tried to take over with a speech about safety and harmony, but Lila cut him off politely and asked him to respond to a single procedural question, whether he had ever visited Elena's unit late during the trip window referenced in the violation notice. Grant's smile froze, and his eyes flicked to Elena, and that flick was louder than any denial. I stood and kept my voice level, and I asked Lila to note that I was submitting a narrow evidence packet limited to household-level proof and payer-owned confirmations. Lila typed, and the projector displayed, evidence received. I placed the sleeves on the table, neat and labeled, and I did not look at the crowd while I did it, because crowds crave eye contact the way fires crave oxygen. Lila read the category labels aloud, then typed them: doorway still frame timestamp, hotel reservation confirmation for 2 guests paid by husband, and the earlier violation notice referencing the same time window. Grant shifted, clearing his throat, and tried to frame it as private marital drama. Lila asked him again, on record, whether he denied being the tall figure entering Elena's doorway late. Grant said he could not confirm the figure, and he tried to make it sound reasonable, but reasonable men do not dodge simple denials. Then Lila did the one thing Elena could not survive. She asked Elena to confirm, on record, whether the weekend reset booking was intended for her husband or for someone else, because the payer line did not match her story. Elena stood and opened her mouth, and you could see her reaching for the script Ray had fed her, but scripts fail when the question is too specific. She said the booking was for her and me, and she said it quickly. Then she hesitated, because she knew the confirmation said 2 guests, and the payer was my name. Lila asked her to state, on record, why my account was being charged for a trip Elena planned alone. Elena looked at Grant, then at Ray, then at the crowd, and her eyes filled with tears that arrived too late to look natural. Grant stepped in and tried to end the session, but one of the board members asked, calmly, whether Grant had used his role to generate a violation letter timed to Elena's trip window, while also offering mediation to manage the fallout. The room went very quiet, because that question did not sound like gossip, it sounded like misconduct. Lila typed the question into the minutes, and the typing itself became the humiliation, because it turned suspicion into record. Grant's face hardened, and he demanded a recess. Lila said recesses require a vote in emergency sessions, and she asked for hands. Only Nolan raised his hand quickly. The board member did not. The second board member did not. The room stayed still. Lila then read the conflict of interest policy line from the HOA bylaws, the one about board members avoiding personal entanglements in enforcement decisions, and she asked Grant to disclose, on record, whether he had a personal relationship with Elena that compromised his role. Grant's mouth tightened, and he said no, and his no sounded like a door slammed too late. I did not argue. I did not add color. I simply asked one final question, calm and surgical, whether he wanted that denial recorded directly beneath the doorway still-frame timestamp in the minutes. Grant stared at the projector, then at Lila's fingers moving, and something in him shifted, because bullies hate ink more than they hate opponents. The other board member placed a motion on the table, temporary removal of Grant's chair privileges pending review, with immediate suspension from complaint handling involving Elena's unit. Lila typed the motion as it was spoken, and the room watched the words appear like a verdict forming in real time. Grant tried to laugh it off, but his laugh died quickly when Lila called for the vote and asked names to be recorded. The board member voted yes. The second board member voted yes. Grant voted no. Lila typed the tally and the outcome, motion passed, and the projector displayed it in plain black text that did not care how charming he thought he was. Elena let out a small sound that was not a sob, not a gasp, but a broken inhale, and Ray's hand tightened around her wrist like she was trying to keep her upright. Grant stood rigid, eyes flat, and for the first time, he looked less like a king and more like a man caught under fluorescent lights. Lila ended the session by stating that the violation notice was suspended pending review and that any further allegations would require dated documentation submitted through her office, not through informal channels. She typed that too. The room saw it. The record sealed it. As people began to stand, a process server stepped into the doorway, asked for Elena by name, and handed her a sealed envelope with a calm, practiced motion that did not invite argument. Elena stared at the envelope like it was radioactive, because she knew what formal paper meant now. I did not speak. I did not gloat. I simply watched the projector screen one last time as Lila typed the closing line, meeting adjourned, evidence retained. The words sat there, boring and permanent, while Elena's carefully rehearsed story collapsed under the weight of plain procedure.